There is a city that exists now only in fragments and in the memory of scholars who have spent their lives trying to understand what it was. It sits at the edge of the Sahara Desert in the landlocked country of Mali in West Africa, at a place where the Niger River bends northward toward the desert before turning south again toward the sea. The city is called Timbuktu, and it has become, in the English language, a byword for remoteness. From here to Timbuktu, meaning from here to somewhere impossibly far away, somewhere at the edge of the known world, somewhere that most people will never reach. But in the 14th century, Timbuktu was not at the edge of the known world, it was near its center. It was one of the wealthiest and most intellectually distinguished cities on the face of the earth, a city of scholars and merchants and pilgrims and poets, a city whose libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on theology, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, law and literature. A city so rich and so famous that the ruler who presided over it was known across 3 continents as the wealthiest human being who had ever lived. His name was Mansa Musa. He ruled the Mali Empire from approximately 1312 to 1337, and the empire he ruled was, at its peak, the largest in West Africa and one of the largest in the world, stretching from the Atlantic coast of what is now Senegal and Gambia in the west to the bend of the Niger River in the east, encompassing the gold fields of Bambouk and Bure and Bono in the south, and the great trans-Saharan trading cities of Timbuktu and Djenné and Gao in the north. It was an empire built on gold and salt, the 2 most valuable commodities in the medieval world, and the empire sat astride the routes along which both of them travelled. The gold came from the forests of the south, extracted from riverbeds and alluvial deposits by methods that the Mali state taxed and controlled without quite monopolizing. The salt came from the vast deposits of the Sahara, particularly from Tagaza in the far north, where slaves cut great blocks of salt from the desert floor and loaded them onto camel caravans that travelled south to the cities where salt was more precious than many metals. And at the intersection of these 2 flows of value, controlling the markets and the roads and the river crossings and the political relationships that made the exchange possible, sat the Mali Empire and its emperor. I want to take you there, not to the moment of Mansa Musa's famous pilgrimage to Mecca. We will get to that. It is impossible not to get to it, because it is one of the most spectacular single events in the history of the medieval world, but to the world that produced him, to the Mali Empire in the decades before 1324, when the empire was at or near its peak, when Timbuktu was becoming what it would become, when the trans-Saharan trade was running at its most productive, and the gold of West Africa was flowing north to Morocco and Egypt, and from there to the markets of Europe and the Middle East, where it was transforming the economies of the medieval world in ways that those economies did not fully understand because they did not know where the gold was coming from. The source of West African gold was, for centuries, one of the most closely guarded secrets in the medieval world. The North African and Arab merchants who bought the gold from the Saharan trading cities knew that it came from somewhere south of the desert, but exactly where and from whom, and by what means, they were not permitted to know. The Mali Empire and its predecessors had a specific policy of not revealing the location of the gold fields. This was not merely prudence, though it was that too. It was a source of mystique and leverage. The gold came from somewhere, from some land whose geography and peoples were unknown to the buyers, and the Mali merchants who controlled the northward flow of the gold maintained that mystique as a commercial and political asset. The Arab geographer and traveller Ibn Battuta, who visited the Mali Empire in 1352 and wrote one of the most important accounts of the empire we possess, was told that the gold came from a land beyond the frontier where the ruler was a pagan and the gold grew from the earth like carrots. This was not a description. It was a carefully maintained mystery. The gold was real. The quantities were extraordinary. In the period of the Mali Empire's greatest commercial power, roughly the 13th and 14th centuries, West African gold may have supplied more than half of the gold in circulation in the medieval world. The Mediterranean economies, from Morocco to Egypt to Italy to the Levant, ran on gold that originated in the forests and river valleys of what is now Guinea and Mali and Senegal, that was traded through the markets of the Saharan cities, that travelled across the desert on the backs of tens of thousands of camels, that arrived in Tunis and Tripoli and Cairo, where it was minted into the gold coins that sustained the monetary economies of the medieval Mediterranean. The Moroccan gold dinar and the Venetian ducat and the Florentine florin and the Egyptian dinar were all, in a specific and material sense, West African gold. The cathedrals of Europe, adorned with gilded altarpieces and reliquaries, contained in their gold the labour of miners who had never heard of Europe and the profits of merchants who had never crossed the Mediterranean. The wealth of the Mali Empire was not merely the wealth of one empire, it was an organising element of the medieval world economy. To understand the Mali Empire, you have to understand the landscape it inhabited. The West African Sahel, the word means shore in Arabic, the shore of the desert, is a band of semi-arid savanna that runs east-west across the continent, south of the Sahara and north of the forest zone. It is not a hospitable landscape by many standards. The rains come once a year, in the summer monsoon that moves north from the Gulf of Guinea, and when they come, they transform the dry brown landscape into something briefly green and productive, and when they leave, the landscape returns to dust and thorny scrub, and the pale grey baobab trees that store water in their enormous trunks and stand through the dry season like the memory of rain. But the Sahel has one feature that made it extraordinarily productive for the specific form of civilization that developed there. It sits at the intersection of the forest zone to the south and the desert to the north, which means it sits at the intersection of two complementary ecological zones whose surpluses are naturally exchangeable. The forest has gold and cola nuts and timber and slaves. The desert has salt. The Sahel is where the exchange happens, and the cities that grew up along the Niger River to facilitate this exchange became, in their peak period, among the most commercially significant cities in the world. The Niger River itself is the key. The Niger rises in the Guinea highlands of what is now Guinea, not far from the Atlantic coast, and flows northeast across the West African savanna, before bending south in a great arc and eventually emptying into the Atlantic in the Niger Delta of modern Nigeria, a trajectory that is counterintuitive and that puzzled European geographers for centuries, because the river seemed to flow away from the sea rather than toward it. The arc of the Niger, its great northward bend into the Sahel before it turned south again, created a natural inland waterway that connected the gold-producing forest zones in the south to the trans-Saharan trade routes in the north. And the cities of the Niger Bend, Jenny, Timbuktu, Gao, and others, were the nodes where the river trade connected to the desert trade. Jenny is older than Timbuktu. It sits on a flood island in the inner Niger Delta, surrounded by seasonal water, built of mud brick in the distinctive Sudano-Sahelian architectural tradition that produces buildings of extraordinary beauty and fragility. The mud brick requires constant maintenance, annual plastering after each rainy season, the community participation in re-mudding the mosque being one of the most celebrated collective rituals in West African urban life. Jenny has been continuously inhabited for over 2,000 years, and for much of that time it was one of the most important commercial cities in the region, a centre of the long-distance trade that connected the forest zone to the Sahara. The Great Mosque of Jenny, the current building dates to 1907, but it stands on the site of a mosque that was old when Mansa Musa's grandfather was born, is the largest mud brick building in the world, a structure of profound architectural power, whose three great towers with their protruding palm wood ribs rise above the mud brick houses of the city, like an assertion of human will against the landscape that has always threatened to reclaim it. Timbuktu came later, but it became more famous. It was founded around the 11th or 12th century CE, initially as a seasonal camp for Tuareg nomads who used its location near the Niger River and a reliable well as a base for the summer period when the pastures of the Sahara were available. It grew into a permanent settlement as the trans-Saharan trade routes became more organised and the demand for a stable commercial centre at the northern bend of the Niger became apparent. By the time the Mali Empire absorbed it in the early 14th century, absorbing it through the classic mechanism of offering protection and commercial access in exchange for political acknowledgement of Malian sovereignty, Timbuktu was already a city of consequence. Under Mali rule it became something more. The market of Timbuktu in the first half of the 14th century was, by the accounts of the Arab travellers and geographers who visited or knew of it, one of the most extraordinary commercial spaces in the medieval world. Gold arrived from the south, carried north along the Niger River and then overland to the city. Salt arrived from the north, carried south across the desert by the great camel caravans that made the 6-week crossing from the salt mines of Tegeza. Cloth arrived from North Africa. The fine linen and woolen textiles of the Moroccan and Egyptian workshops traded south in exchange for the raw materials that West Africa produced. Cola nuts travelled from the forest zone, their mild stimulant properties and long shelf life making them a commodity of remarkable value along the trade routes. The cola nut was the caffeine of the pre-coffee medieval Sahel, as valued as coffee would later become, and traded over comparable distances. Books travelled. This is the thing that I find most extraordinary about the Timbuktu trade. Manuscripts were a significant commercial commodity in the city's markets, bought and sold alongside gold and salt and cloth, because Timbuktu had become, by the 14th century, one of the most important centres of Islamic scholarship in the world. And Islamic scholarship ran on manuscripts, the scholars of Timbuktu. I need to spend time with them, because they are the aspect of this civilization most consistently overlooked in the accounts that reach most Western readers, and they are, in the specific sense of what their work represents, the most important thing about the city. Timbuktu at its peak housed several major institutions of Islamic learning, the Sankor Mosque and its associated school being the most famous, to the point where Sankor became in some sources a synonym for the city's intellectual life. The scholars who studied and taught at these institutions were not provincial figures working at the periphery of the Islamic intellectual world. They were participants in the mainstream of medieval Islamic scholarship, corresponding with scholars in Cairo and Fez and Baghdad, debating the finer points of Islamic jurisprudence and theology and astronomy and mathematics, producing work that was known and read across the Islamic world, the manuscripts. Hundreds of thousands of manuscripts survived in Timbuktu until relatively recently. Recent scholarship has revised the often cited figure of 700,000 manuscripts upward, downward, and in every direction as the actual count has proceeded, but the number is certainly in the tens of thousands and possibly much higher. These manuscripts cover an extraordinary range of subjects: Quranic commentary and Islamic jurisprudence, as expected in a city of Islamic scholarship, but also mathematics and astronomy, and medicine and history and geography, and poetry and philosophy, and the records of commercial transactions, and the correspondence of scholars and the diaries of travellers. The manuscripts are in Arabic, the scholarly language of the Islamic world, but also in Ajami, the practice of writing African languages, including Mandi and Songhai and Fulani, in Arabic script, creating a body of literature in local languages that has been less studied than the Arabic materials, but that is equally significant as a record of the civilization's intellectual life. The astronomical manuscripts of Timbuktu are particularly striking to anyone who has absorbed the assumption that serious astronomical science in the medieval world was confined to Europe and the Islamic heartlands of the Middle East. The Timbuktu astronomers were not merely copying the astronomical tables of Ptolemy and his Arab successors. They were making observations, recording the positions of stars and planets with the equipment available to them, and producing tables and commentaries that reflect genuine engagement with the empirical study of the heavens. The astronomical tradition of West African Islam was a real intellectual tradition, not a provincial echo of a more sophisticated original elsewhere, the Mansa. The title means king or ruler in Mande, the language of the Mandinka people, who were the dominant ethnic group of the Mali Empire. Mansa Musa was not the founder of the Mali Empire. That honour belongs to Sundiata Keita, who in the early 13th century united the Mandinka chieftaincies and defeated the Soso king Sumunguru Kante at the Battle of Karina in 1235, the founding moment of the empire that Musa would rule nearly a century later. But Mansa Musa was the empire's greatest ruler, the one whose reign represented the fullest expression of what the Mali state had been building toward since Sundiata's time. And he is the one who made the empire visible to the wider world in the way that no amount of quiet prosperity and steady commerce could have done. The figure of Sundiata Keita is worth pausing on, because his story became one of the great epic narratives of West African oral tradition. The Sundiata epic, still performed by griots across the Mandi world, is one of the foundational texts of West African literature, comparable in its cultural weight to the Iliad or the Mahabharata. The griots, Jelly and Mandi, are the professional praise singers and oral historians of the Mandi world. the keepers of the genealogies and the histories and the praise songs and the stories that gave the Mali aristocracy its identity and its legitimacy. They accompanied the Mansa everywhere. They sang the praises of the powerful and recorded the deeds of the great. They were not merely entertainers. They were, in a specific and important sense, the living memory of the civilization, the institution that did for the Mali Empire what the scribal tradition of Mesopotamia and the Library of Alexandria did for their respective civilizations, but through the medium of performance and memory rather than text. The Sundiata epic tells the story of a young man who was crippled in childhood, unable to walk, scorned by his father's other wives, forced into exile with his mother after his father's death, who grew up in foreign courts and learnt the arts of kingship and returned to his homeland to defeat the tyrannical Sumanguru Kante and found an empire. The story has the structure of the hero's journey in a form so pure and so well executed that when scholars first began to study it seriously in the 20th century, some of them suspected it must be a recent composition shaped by exposure to Western literary models. It is not. The epic is genuinely old, and its narrative power comes from the same source as all great narrative power. It is about something that human beings recognize as true, about the connection between suffering and achievement, between exile and return, between the weak child who becomes the strong king. Mansa Musa was the empire's 10th Mansa, inheriting a state that was already wealthy and powerful and organized, and that he would make wealthier, more powerful, and more organized during his 25-year reign. The administration of the Mali Empire was sophisticated. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by a governor called a farin, who was usually a relative of the Mansa or a member of the Malian aristocracy. The governors collected taxes and administered justice and maintained order and sent regular tribute to the imperial capital at Niani, in the savannah south of the Niger River. The army was large and well organized. Estimates of its size vary, but the core professional force was probably several tens of thousands of cavalry and infantry, supplemented by the levies that the provincial governors could raise. The cavalry was particularly important, and the horses that equipped it were a significant import. Horses bred well only in the Sahel and the Sahara, and the forest zone was unsuitable for them because of the tsetse fly that made horsekeeping there impossible. Horses came from North Africa across the Saharan trade routes, and the Mali military's dependence on imported horses was one of the structural vulnerabilities of the empire that its successors would eventually exploit. The imperial capital of Niani was not the commercial heart of the empire. That role belonged to Djenné and Timbuktu and the other Niger Bend cities. Niani was the political and ceremonial heart, the place where the Mansa held court, where the ambassadors came and the tribute was presented and the great ceremonies of state took place. The Mansa's court was, by the accounts of those who visited it, a spectacle of considerable magnificence. The Mansa receiving visitors behind a curtain, surrounded by his advisors and his griots and his guard, dressed in the specific regalia of Malian royalty. The audience conducted through elaborate ceremony and protocol. The account of Ibn Battuta, who visited Niani in 1352, is the most detailed we have of the court's operation, and it is full of vivid detail. The prostrations required of those who approached the Mansa, the dusty earth poured on the head as a sign of submission, the way the griots' praise songs interrupted the proceedings at moments of significance, the musicians and the jesters and the presence of a vast number of hangers-on and attendants. Now the pilgrimage. In 1324, Mansa Musa announced his intention to perform the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, required of every Muslim who is able to perform it at least once in their lifetime. This was not unusual. Previous Mansa had made the Hajj, and it was understood as a statement of religious commitment and also as a diplomatic act. The Hajj was an opportunity to meet the rulers and scholars and merchants of the Islamic world, to establish Mali's place in that world's hierarchy of states, to demonstrate the empire's wealth and power to an audience far beyond West Africa. What was unusual was the scale of what Mansa Musa brought with him. The accounts differ in their specifics, as accounts of extraordinary events always do. Some sources say he brought 60,000 men with him, others say 12,000 personal servants. Some say he had 100 camel loads of gold, others 500. The Egyptian account says the gold he distributed in Egypt caused the price of gold to fall and remained depressed for more than a decade. Historians have argued about the precise figures for centuries, and the precise figures will probably never be established. What is not in doubt is the basic outline. Mansa Musa performed the Hajj in 1324–25 with an entourage of extraordinary size and wealth. He distributed gold with extraordinary generosity in Egypt and in the Hedjaz, and the economic consequences of this distribution were significant enough that contemporaries recorded them with a mixture of astonishment and complaint. The route from Mali to Mecca crossed the Sahara and Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula, a journey of several months in each direction, covering thousands of miles of desert. The camel caravan that carried Mansa Musa and his entourage would have been one of the largest single caravans to cross the Saharan routes in the medieval period. The organization required to move such a body of people and animals through the desert, the logistics of water and food and fodder, the management of the animals, the security against the bandits and the raiding nomads who preyed on trans-Saharan caravans, was itself a demonstration of the Mali state's organizational capacity. You do not bring 60,000 people across the Sahara without a very sophisticated system of advanced planning and support. The caravan reached Cairo, and Cairo was where the story became legend. The governor of Egypt who received Mansa Musa was al-Nasir Muhammad ibn Qalawun, the Sultan of Egypt, who had been in power since 1310 and who was accustomed to the visits of powerful rulers. He was not accustomed to what Mansa Musa brought. The Egyptian sources describe Musa's arrival in Cairo with a vocabulary that is rarely used for visiting rulers. Astonishment is the dominant note, the size of the entourage, the quality of the dress and equipment, the quantity of gold, the sheer, overwhelming, material fact of an emperor who was, by any standard the Egyptians could apply, fabulously wealthy. And Mansa Musa gave it away. He gave it away in the markets of Cairo, where his servants and followers bought goods at prices the sellers had not imagined asking. He gave it away in gifts to the Sultan and the Sultan's officials and the scholars he met. He gave it away to the poor he encountered along his route. He gave it away in endowments to the mosques of Mecca and Medina. The Arabic sources describe this generosity with a consistent vocabulary of excessiveness, not admiration exactly, but something more complicated, because the generosity that Mansa Musa displayed was real generosity, religiously mandated generosity, the generosity of a man who understood that his wealth was not truly his own, but held in trust for the community of believers, and that the Hajj was the appropriate moment for its most visible expression. The economic consequences were real and lasting. The Egyptian historian al-Makarizi, writing about 80 years after the event, recorded that the gold Mansa Musa brought to Egypt remained in the market for 12 years, depressing the price of gold and causing significant economic disruption to the merchants and craftsmen who dealt in it. This is one of the earliest and clearest examples in the historical record of what economists would later call an inflationary shock caused by an increase in the money supply. When Mansa Musa flooded the Cairo markets with gold, the purchasing power of existing gold holdings declined because the same goods now required more gold to purchase. The Cairo merchants who had held gold as a store of value watched its value fall because what they held was suddenly less scarce. An emperor's generosity, expressed in the specific form of distributing enormous quantities of gold, had the same effect as a very large increase in the money supply. And the effect, once it propagated through the trading networks of the medieval Mediterranean, was felt well beyond Egypt. This single economic event, the Cairo gold flood of 1324, is one of the reasons that historians sometimes describe Mansa Musa as the wealthiest individual in human history. The claim is unverifiable in any precise sense, because we have no reliable figures for the total wealth of Mali's treasury, and comparing wealth across historical periods requires a series of assumptions that can be challenged at every step. But the magnitude of what he gave away in a single journey, and the fact that giving it away caused a decade-long depression in the gold price of the most commercially sophisticated economy in the medieval world, suggests a level of wealth that is difficult to compare with any other historical figure. The medieval world's economy was small by our standards, and what was required to dominate it was correspondingly less in absolute terms, but in relative terms, in the proportion of the world's monetary base that a single individual controlled, Mansa Musa was genuinely in a category of his own. He also brought something back from his pilgrimage. He brought scholars, He brought the Andalusian poet and architect Abu Ishaq Ibrahim al-Sahili, who had come from Granada in Spain, to the court of the Moroccan Sultan, and whom Mansa Musa met in Mecca and persuaded to return with him to Mali. Al-Sahili became one of the most important figures in the architectural history of West Africa. He introduced to the Mali Empire the fired brick and the flat roof, and the recessed facade with its niches and buttresses that became the defining features of the Sahelo-Sudanese architectural style that still characterizes the mosques and buildings of the region. He designed or contributed to the design of mosques in Jenni and Gao, and possibly Timbuktu. He was paid in gold at a rate that the sources describe in terms that suggest enormous generosity, 12,000 mithqals of gold for his service, by one account, which at the market rates of the time would have been a fortune by any standard. The building program that Mansa Musa initiated on his return from the Hajj was one of the defining investments of his reign. He built mosques and palaces and the audience chambers where the Mansa received his subjects. He built or expanded the physical infrastructure of the empire's commercial cities, and he invested in something less visible but no less important, the intellectual infrastructure. The scholars he brought back from Mecca and from Egypt and from Morocco were not merely ornaments. They were teachers and administrators and judges, participants in the broader Islamic scholarly world, whose presence in Timbuktu elevated the city's academic status and drew other scholars to it. The great period of Timbuktu's intellectual flowering, the period when the Sankour Mosque became a center of Islamic learning, comparable to the great universities of the Islamic world, begins in Mansa Musa's reign and extends through the reigns of his successors. The trans-Saharan trade was not merely the exchange of gold and salt, though those were its most spectacular elements. It was also the route by which ideas and technologies and religious practices and political models moved between the Islamic world of the north and the societies of West Africa. Islam itself had arrived in the Sahel via the trade routes, carried by North African merchants who maintained their religious practice in the cities where they traded, and whose example and persuasion gradually drew the rulers and elites of the Sahelian cities toward the faith. The conversion of the Malian aristocracy to Islam was not a sudden event. It was a gradual process, beginning in the early medieval period and accelerating through the 11th and 12th centuries, and it was driven primarily by the commercial advantages that being Muslim brought: access to the networks of Islamic commerce, the trust that came with shared religious identity, the legitimacy that Muslim rulers enjoyed in the eyes of the North African and Middle Eastern merchants, who were their most important trading partners. But Islam in West Africa was not simply a transplant from the north. It was something that was adapted and reinterpreted and made to fit the specific cultural and social realities of the Sahelian world. The West African Islam of the Mali Empire coexisted with elements of the pre-Islamic religious tradition, the spirits of the land, the power of specific sacred objects, the authority of the blacksmiths and hunters and other specialist groups whose powers predated and survived the Islamic conversion of the elite. The griots, who were essential to Malian court life and whose praise singing was rooted in pre-Islamic tradition, continue to function in an Islamic political environment in ways that required ongoing negotiation between the Islamic orthodoxy of the scholars and the traditional religious functions of the praise singers. This negotiation between the universal claims of Islamic law and the specific cultural traditions of a particular people is one of the most interesting and most underexplored aspects of Malian civilization, and it is a negotiation that was not resolved in Mansa Musa's time and is not resolved today. Ibn Battuta arrived in Mali in 1352, 15 years after Mansa Musa's death. He came from Sijil Massa in Morocco, travelling south with the Salt caravan from Tagaza, a journey he describes as one of the most difficult he had experienced in a lifetime of extraordinary travel. He arrived at the court of the reigning Mansa, Mansa Suleiman, Musa's brother, and stayed for approximately 8 months. His account of what he found is one of the most important primary sources for the history of the Mali Empire, and reading it is a somewhat disorienting experience because it does not fit the narratives either of primitive African society or of a romanticized golden age that later interpreters have tried to impose on it. What Ibn Battuta found was a sophisticated state with organized administration and reliable justice, and a population that was, by his account, notable for its piety and its observance of Islamic law. He admired the security of the roads, that travelers could go anywhere in the empire without fear of robbery, and the reliability of the justice system. He was struck by the Muslim women of Mali who did not observe the purdah that he associated with proper Islamic practice. They moved freely in public, received male visitors, engaged in trade, and he found this disturbing and said so, because his frame of reference was the Islamic world of North Africa and the Middle East, where female seclusion was more common. His discomfort with Malian women's public presence is a reminder that Islamic civilization was not a monolithic thing, but a world of varied practices shaped by local traditions, and that the Islam of Mali was not the Islam of Cairo or Mecca, but a specific West African version of the faith. He was also struck by the public ceremonies of the court, the way the Mansa received visitors, the role of the griots, the specific rituals of submission and praise that structured the court's public life, and his descriptions of these ceremonies, while sometimes tinged with the condescension of a man from the established centers of Islamic culture, visiting what he considered a peripheral region, provide a vivid picture of the specific political culture of the Mali court. The griots' praise songs, the dust poured on the head, the Mansa invisible behind a curtain. All of this was specific to the Malian political tradition, shaped by the pre-Islamic culture of the Mande world, and accommodated to the Islamic framework that the ruling elite had adopted. Ibn Battuta left Mali, still dismissive of some of what he had seen but clear-eyed about its commercial and political significance. The Mali Empire was not, from his account, a civilization at the margins of history. It was a state of considerable sophistication, governing a large population over an enormous territory, participating in the global economy of the medieval world through the trade networks that connected West Africa to the Mediterranean and the Middle East, maintaining a court of genuine magnificence and an intellectual life of genuine distinction. That it has been consistently undervalued in the historical memory of the West says something about the West's relationship with African history, not about the actual significance of what Mansa Musa built. The empire did not survive. The great empires of the Sahel did not tend to survive, because the conditions that made them possible, the specific configuration of trade routes and ecological zones and political relationships that allowed a state to control the commercial network, were not stable over the long term. The Mali Empire began to decline in the late 14th century, under pressure from external enemies and internal succession crises. The Songhai Empire, centered at Gao on the eastern Niger Bend, gradually asserted independence and then dominance. By the late 15th century, the Songhai had absorbed most of what had been the Mali Empire's commercial heartland, including Timbuktu, and the Mali state had contracted to a much smaller area in its original heartland near Niani. The Songhai Empire itself was eventually destroyed by the Moroccan Saadian dynasty's invasion in 1591, a crossing of the Sahara by a Moroccan army equipped with firearms that the Songhai could not match. And after the Moroccan conquest, the political organization of the region fragmented in ways from which it did not recover for centuries. The manuscripts of Timbuktu survived in the care of the scholarly families who had accumulated them over centuries. They survived the Moroccan conquest, which was followed by a period of instability, but not the wholesale destruction of the intellectual heritage. They survived the French colonial period, hidden in private collections and family vaults. They survived the independence of Mali in 1960. They very nearly did not survive what happened in 2012, when the jihadist group Ansar Dine took control of Timbuktu and began destroying the ancient heritage sites of the city. The manuscript scholars and librarians of Timbuktu, working with remarkable courage and ingenuity, managed to remove hundreds of thousands of manuscripts from the city before the jihadists could reach them, transporting them south to the capital Bamako, in secret, in lorries and boats and under the clothing of carriers who were taking the most extraordinary commercial risk imaginable in the service of an intellectual heritage that they understood was irreplaceable. Some manuscripts were destroyed, most were saved. The operation to save them is one of the more extraordinary acts of cultural preservation in recent history, the work of specific named individuals who understood what they were protecting and what it would mean to lose it. The manuscripts are in Bamako now, being catalogued and digitized in a process that will take decades. Scholars who can read medieval Arabic and Ajami are working through them, and what they are finding is not a secondary reflection of the Islamic scholarship of the Arab heartlands, but an original body of thought, produced in a specific place by specific people who are engaging with the intellectual traditions of their world in their own way, for their own purposes, in response to their own questions. The Timbuktu manuscripts are a primary source for the history of West African Islamic civilization, in the same way that the Dead Sea Scrolls are a primary source for the history of Second Temple Judaism, not the only source, not even the most important source, but a body of primary material whose full significance has not yet been understood because the process of reading and analysing them is only beginning. Mansa Musa, the man who floods the markets of Cairo with gold, who crosses the Sahara with 60,000 men, who brings the Andalusian architect back to build the mosques of the Niger Bend, the man whose pilgrimage is famous enough that it appears on a 14th century European map, the Catalan Atlas of 1375, produced in Majorca, shows a figure identified as Mansa Musa, seated on a throne in West Africa, holding a gold nugget, with the inscription describing him as the richest king in Africa. European cartographers, drawing maps of the world as they understood it in 1375, found Mansa Musa significant enough to place him on the map by name, with his gold. But Mansa Musa was also the man who funded the construction of mosques and the expansion of the Sankore school. He was the man who created the conditions under which Timbuktu became what it became. Not merely a commercial city, but an intellectual city. A city where manuscripts were treasured and scholars were supported, and the life of the mind was understood to be as important as the life of trade. The man who made the gold also made the libraries. The two things were not separate. The wealth of the trans-Saharan trade and the scholarship of the Sankore Mosque were expressions of the same civilization, two faces of a world that understood that commerce and learning were not opposed but complementary, that the city where goods were exchanged was also the city where ideas were exchanged, that the same routes that carried salt and gold carried books and scholars. I think about the griots, the jelly who accompanied Mansa Musa on his pilgrimage, who sang his praises before the Sultan of Egypt and the scholars of Mecca, who carried in their memories the genealogies and the histories of the Mandinka aristocracy back to Sundiata and beyond. Their knowledge was not written. It lived in the voice, in the performance, in the chain of transmission from teacher to student that was as carefully maintained as any scribal tradition, but more vulnerable. Dependent on the continuity of specific people in specific communities, on the survival of the institutions and the patronage systems that supported the griot profession, on the political conditions that gave the griot access to the courts and the ceremonies where the oral tradition was performed and renewed. Much of what the griots knew is gone. Not all of it. The Sundiata epic survives in versions that have been collected and recorded since the 20th century, and the griot tradition continues in parts of the Mande world, adapted and changed by the passage of time and the disruption of colonialism and independence, but not entirely broken. But the specific knowledge of specific courts, the specific histories of specific lineages, the specific praise songs for rulers whose names are now unknown, this is gone, in the same way that the medical knowledge of the Doggerland healers is gone, and the stories of the Mesolithic communities of the North Sea Plain are gone. The performance tradition is more robust than the purely oral tradition, because the performer requires an audience, and the audience creates the conditions for continuation. But it is less robust than the written tradition, because the performer is human and mortal, and the institutions that support performance can be destroyed more easily than the manuscripts that preserve text. The Sahara is changing. The desertification that has been advancing southward for decades is reshaping the landscape of the Sahel in ways that affect the same geography that made the Mali Empire possible. The specific configuration of desert edge and river and savanna that created the conditions for the great Sahelian trading cities is under pressure from a climate that is making the desert larger and the Sahel drier. The Niger River's flow is irregular in ways that threaten the inner delta agriculture that has supported the cities of the region for centuries. Timbuktu, which sits at the very edge of the desert, is being encroached upon by sand dunes that require constant community effort to prevent from swallowing the city. The landscape is changing, as the North Sea landscape changed when the sea rose, as the landscape of the Mediterranean changed when the Roman economic network collapsed. Landscapes change. The civilizations built on specific landscape features are always vulnerable to the changes that those features are subject to. But the manuscripts are in Bamako, and the gold is in the Catalan Atlas, held by a painted king on a painted throne, recognizable to anyone who knows where to look, on a map made by a European cartographer in 1375 who understood that the world extended further than Europe, and that in the lands beyond the desert there was a ruler whose wealth made the kings of Christendom look modest. Mansa Musa held his gold up in the painted map, and the gold caught the light, and the light has not gone out. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me slow down. Let me take you back into the city before the pilgrimage, before the famous journey, before the moment that made Mansa Musa a figure visible in the historical record of 3 continents. Let me take you to Timbuktu in the years before 1324, when the city was becoming what it would become. The morning in Timbuktu begins before dawn. The muezzins call from the Sankor Mosque, a building of mud brick with its distinctive protruding palmwood ribs, not yet the mosque that al-Sahili will help design after Musa's return from the Hajj, but an earlier version of the same building on the same ground, carries across the sleeping city, and the students in the attached school wake to the first prayer. The students at Sankor are not all West African. Some have come from Morocco, from Egypt, from the oasis towns of the Sahara, drawn by the reputation of specific teachers and the resources of the city. Others are local, sons of the Mandinka and Songhai and Tuareg merchant families who have grown rich on the trans-Saharan trade and who understand that the investment in a son's education at Sankor is an investment in the family's long-term commercial and political position. The language of instruction is Arabic, and some of the students have grown up speaking it as a second or third language alongside their mother tongues, and others have had to learn it specifically for the purpose of study, the way that European students in a later period would learn Latin. The curriculum at Sankor is recognizable as the curriculum of medieval Islamic higher education. The Quran and its exegesis, the Hadith, the traditions and sayings of the Prophet, and their interpretation, Islamic jurisprudence in its several schools, Arabic grammar and rhetoric, logic, astronomy and mathematics, and the other disciplines that the Islamic world had developed into systematic fields of inquiry over the preceding 5 centuries. The texts used are texts that were used in Cairo and Fez and Baghdad, the same texts, copied out by hand in the Timbuktu scriptorium, or carried south across the Sahara in the bundles that the caravan merchants brought from the north. The scholars at Sankor were not cut off from the mainstream of Islamic intellectual life. They were part of it, reading the same books and debating the same questions and producing their own contributions to the ongoing conversation. The merchant who wakes in Timbuktu on the same morning that the students are beginning their first prayer is a different kind of person thinking different kinds of thoughts. He has a consignment of salt, 6 large blocks, each weighing perhaps 50 kilograms, cut from the mines at Tagaza 6 weeks ago and carried south by a camel caravan that lost 2 animals to the heat in the central desert and arrived in Timbuktu 4 days ago. The salt will sell at a good price in the city's market, where it is always in demand, and with the proceeds he will buy gold, the small nuggets and the gold dust that come north from the forest zone by a different route, up the Niger River by canoe and then overland to the city's markets. The gold will travel north with the next caravan, and in Sijil Massa or Tunis it will be sold to the agents of the Moroccan or Egyptian mints, who will have it refined and struck into the coins that will circulate through the Mediterranean economy. This merchant has made this journey many times. He knows the Sahara the way a sailor knows the sea, not as a barrier, but as a medium, a space with its own roots and rhythms and dangers, traversable by those who understand it, and fatal to those who do not. He knows which wells are reliable, and which are uncertain in drought years. He knows which of the nomadic groups along the route can be trusted, and which require payment for passage, and which should simply be avoided, if at all possible. He knows the specific astronomical markers that allow navigation in the featureless interior of the desert, the stars and their positions relative to the horizon that tell him which direction he is moving in the dark of a starry night. He carries in his head a map of the Sahara that would be more accurate for the purposes of crossing it than anything that could be drawn on paper. Because the map in his head is not a fixed representation, but a dynamic model that incorporates seasonal variation and political information and the accumulated knowledge of 100 crossings. He has family in Timbuktu, not the family he was born into. They are in Sijil Massa, in Morocco, but the commercial family he has built over years of regular trading, the agent who manages his storage in the city, the money changer who converts between the currencies of the north and the gold dust measures of the south. The judge at the Sankor Mosque, who has resolved his commercial disputes and whose impartiality he trusts. These relationships are not merely commercial, they are sustained by the shared identity of Muslim merchants operating within the Islamic commercial system, a system built on the specific religious and legal infrastructure that Islam provides. The prohibition of interest makes certain financial instruments unusable, but other instruments, the commender contract, the partnership arrangements, the bills of exchange, are well developed and legally enforceable in Islamic courts. The Qadi, the Islamic judge, is the institution that makes long-distance trade possible, because without reliable dispute resolution, the trust required for long-distance commercial relationships cannot be sustained. The Qadi of Timbuktu in this period is a man of considerable authority. He administers Islamic law, adjudicates commercial disputes, and oversees the religious and charitable institutions of the city. He is also, typically, a scholar of distinction. The Qadi position in a major Islamic city was a prestigious appointment that required both legal and theological training of the highest order. The Qadis of Timbuktu in the 14th and 15th centuries were figures of real intellectual standing, not merely judicial administrators, but participants in the scholarly life of the city, authors of legal opinions that were cited and debated across the Islamic world. Let me give you one of them. Ahmad ibn Muhammad Akit was a Qadi of Timbuktu in the early 16th century, slightly after the period of Mansa Musa, but in a direct line of institutional descent from the intellectual tradition he established. The Akit family was one of the great scholarly families of Timbuktu, a family that had accumulated manuscripts over generations and that produced several of the most distinguished scholars in the city's history. Ahmad ibn Muhammad was known for his legal opinions on commercial questions, the specific problems that arose in a city whose economy was based on long-distance trade across different legal and cultural systems. How do you enforce a contract made in Arabic in a court in Timbuktu? What law governs the relationship between a Muslim merchant from Morocco and a non-Muslim merchant from the forest zone? These were not merely theoretical questions. They were questions that the daily life of the city required answers to, and the Qadi who could provide clear, learned and practically applicable answers to them was the institutional glue that held the commercial community together. Ahmad ibn Muhammad's son, Muhammad Mahmud ibn Umar, became even more famous. Known as Mahmud Qati, he was a scholar and historian who began writing the Tarikh al-Fatash, the Chronicle of the Seeker, in the early 16th century, a history of the Songhai Empire and its predecessors that is one of the most important primary sources for the history of the Niger Bend region. Mahmud Qati was born in 1468, just before the Songhai Empire under Sunni Ali reached its greatest extent, and he lived through the period of Songhai dominance, the Moroccan invasion of 1591, and the subsequent decades of disruption. The chronicle he began was continued by his grandson, and the text that survives is a layered document, reflecting the perspectives and the knowledge of 3 generations of the same scholarly family across more than a century of turbulent history. It is also a document that contains, in its account of the Mali Empire's legacy and the Songhai period that followed it, some of the most vivid and specific historical detail we have about the scholarly and commercial life of the Niger Bend cities in the period when they were at their most flourishing. The trans-Saharan trade that made all of this possible depended on the camel in the same way that the Silk Road depended on the Bactrian camel. The specific animal adapted to the specific conditions of the specific terrain. The dromedary camel, the one-humped variety that is native to Arabia and North Africa, was introduced to the Sahara in the first few centuries of the Common Era, and its adoption transformed the economics of the desert crossing. Before the camel, the Sahara was not uncrossable. There is evidence of trans-Saharan contact predating the camel, but it was extraordinarily difficult and expensive. The camel made it merely very difficult and moderately expensive. A single camel can carry perhaps 250 kilograms of cargo. It can go for several weeks without water in cool weather, longer than any other domestic animal. It tolerates heat that would kill a horse or an ox within hours. Its wide, padded feet distribute its weight on sand in a way that allows it to move across surfaces that would swallow a narrower hoofed animal. Its ability to eat thorny desert plants that other animals will not touch, and to extract nutrition from poor quality forage, gives it a dietary range that no other large animal matches in desert conditions. The camel caravans of the trans-Saharan trade were organized by specific communities, Berber and Tuareg and Arab nomads, who had developed the knowledge and the animal stock to operate in the desert over generations. They were not freelancers, they were professionals in the most demanding sense, operating in an environment where a mistake could kill everyone and everything in the caravan, where the knowledge of how to read the desert was literally the difference between life and death. Their knowledge of the Saharan routes was as specific and as hard-won as the Doggerland hunters' knowledge of the salmon rivers or the Silk Road merchants' knowledge of the Pamir passes. It was knowledge that lived in practice, in the body, in the accumulated experience of many crossings, and it was transmitted within families and communities across generations. The salt of Tagaza. I have mentioned it several times, but I have not given it the attention it deserves, because salt in the medieval Sahel was not what salt is for us. We have so much salt, available so cheaply, that it is difficult to recover the understanding of what salt meant to a society that did not have it in surplus. Salt is essential for human survival at more than a trivial level. The body cannot function without sodium, and in the absence of dietary salt, the body will eventually die. In the West African forest zone, where the rainfall is high and the rivers flood annually and the soil is leached of minerals, salt was genuinely scarce, and the demand for it was not a luxury demand, but a survival demand. The people of the forest zone needed salt the way the people of the Sahel needed water. Absolutely, without substitution, without negotiation. And the salt of Tagaza, extracted by slave labor from the thick deposits of halite that lie just below the desert surface at one of the most inhospitable points in the entire Sahara, was the primary source of this survival resource for millions of people across a vast territory. The price differential between the salt mines and the markets of the forest zone was extraordinary. The Arab geographer al-Idrisi, writing in the 12th century, reported that salt was traded weight for weight against gold in the forest markets, that a certain weight of salt could be exchanged for the same weight of gold. This claim has been debated by historians and may represent an exaggeration, but even if the ratio was significantly less extreme, the implied price differential is remarkable. A commodity that was mined at essentially no material cost beyond the labor of the slaves who extracted it was worth, at its point of sale in the forest zone, a substantial fraction of the value of gold. The trans-Saharan trade captured the difference between these two valuations, and the Mali Empire's control of the routes and the markets allowed it to extract a significant share of that difference as taxes and tribute and trading profits. The gold of the forest zone was not mined in the same way that European or Asian gold mining worked. The primary method was alluvial mining, washing gold from the gravel beds of rivers and streams in the forest zone, a technique that required relatively little technology but enormous amounts of labor. The specific geography of the gold-producing regions, the Bambouk goldfields in what is now eastern Senegal and western Mali, the Bouré fields in what is now northern Guinea, the Bono fields further east, were known to the Mali Empire and were under its political jurisdiction or influence, but the actual mining was done by the local populations, and the Mali state's relationship with the miners was a careful one. You did not want to antagonize the people who extracted the gold. You wanted to tax them, not destroy them. The Mali Mansa's power over the gold trade was not primarily the power of direct control over the mines. The mines were in many cases in areas where the empire's administrative reach was limited. It was the power of controlling the markets where the gold was traded and the routes by which it travelled north. The gold had to reach Timbuktu and Jenny and Gao before it could be sold to the North African merchants, and the Mali state controlled the cities and the routes. Any merchant who wanted to buy West African gold had to do business on terms that the Mali state set, and the Mali state enforced those terms with a military power that was real enough to make compliance rational. The weapons that enforced this power were not the sophisticated arms of the medieval Islamic world. The Mali military relied primarily on cavalry, on the horsemen who could move rapidly across the savannah and whose speed and impact were decisive against infantry. The horses were expensive imports from North Africa, carried south across the Saharan trade routes. The Mali cavalry's dependence on imported horses meant that the empire's military power was tied to the continuing flow of the commercial network, a circular dependency that made trade and military power each necessary to the other. The military also relied on something less tangible, the authority of the Mansa and the loyalty of the provincial governors. The Mali Empire governed an enormous territory with a relatively small administrative apparatus, and the mechanism by which distant provinces were kept loyal was the combination of commercial benefit and dynastic relationship. As long as those benefits flowed, loyalty was commercially rational. When the empire became less able to guarantee them, the provincial loyalties dissolved and the empire contracted. Mansa Musa understood this. His Hajj was not merely a religious act, it was also a diplomatic act of enormous sophistication. By performing the Hajj with such spectacular wealth, he was announcing to the entire Islamic world that the Mali Empire was a power to be reckoned with, that its ruler was a legitimate Muslim sovereign of the first rank, that the gold fields of West Africa were under the control of a state that knew how to conduct itself in the wider world. The relationships he established in Cairo and in Mecca, with the Egyptian Sultan, with the scholars of the Hejaz, with the merchants and diplomats of the Islamic world, were relationships that would benefit the Mali state commercially and politically for years after his return. The diplomat who makes an impression does not need to press every advantage in the moment. He plants seeds that grow. The figure who shadows all of this is not Mansa Musa himself, but the ordinary person. The farmer near Niani who paid his taxes in millet and cloth, the student at Sankor who had walked 2 weeks to get there and was eating once a day and reading manuscripts in a language his grandparents had not spoken, the woman in the Jenny market who sold dried fish and whose world was organized around the gold dust and cowrie shells that served as currency, the slave in the salt mines at Tagaza, cutting salt in brutal desert heat, whose labor was the foundation of the entire commercial system that the manuscripts and the mosques and the Hajj caravan depended on. The slavery in the trans-Saharan trade was not incidental, it was structural. The salt mines were worked by slaves. The trans-Saharan trade exported slaves northward alongside gold and salt. The domestic slavery of the Mali court was extensive. The prosperity of the Mali Empire rested in part on the exploitation of enslaved people, and any honest account of the civilization has to say so, even as it acknowledges the civilization's remarkable achievements. The manuscripts of Timbuktu say almost nothing about this. The slave at Tagaza did not write manuscripts. His experience is accessible to us only in the incidental mentions of travelers and merchants, in the aggregate statistics that trade records imply. He was there. He mattered. The salt that he cut is what made the gold trade possible, because without salt the populations of the forest zone could not sustain themselves, and without those populations there was no demand for the gold that funded the libraries and the mosques and the gilded image on the Catalan Atlas. The light falls on all of it equally, and the historical record falls on almost none of it. What we have is the fragments, the manuscripts, the coins, the accounts of travellers, the marks on the landscape where the cities stood and the mines were worked and the caravan routes crossed the desert. From these fragments we construct the empire, imperfectly, with the tools of scholarship and interpretation and imagination, knowing that what we construct is not the thing itself, but the best approximation we can make of a thing that was once fully real and is now accessible only in these traces. Mansa Musa and his 60,000 men crossing the Sahara in 1324. The sun on the desert, the vast caravan stretching for miles behind and before. The gold in the saddlebags, the scholars in the entourage. The griots singing the praise of the greatest ruler of the age in the language of a people who had built an empire from the gold of the earth and the salt of the desert and the scholarship of the mosques and the trade that connected all of it to the wider world. The light catches the gold in the painted image on the Catalan Atlas, and it has not stopped catching it yet. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me take you to the desert itself, because the desert is not a backdrop in this story, it is a character. The Sahara that divided the Mediterranean world from the West African world was also the medium through which they were connected, and understanding it, understanding what it meant to cross it, what it required of the people who crossed it, what it gave and what it took, is essential to understanding the civilization that thrived at its southern edge. The Sahara is the largest hot desert in the world, covering approximately 9 million square kilometers, roughly the area of the United States. It is not uniformly sandy. Much of it is rocky plateau and gravel plain, and only about a quarter of it is the spectacular dune landscape that appears in most people's mental image of the desert. The dune landscapes are the most challenging for travel, precisely because the dunes shift, and because orientation in them is difficult. The rocky plains and gravel flats are easier to cross, but offer no shade and little water. The entire Sahara receives on average less than 25 millimeters of rainfall per year. And in the central regions, the average is much less than that. Some areas go years between significant rainfall events. The temperature extremes are severe. Summer days in the deep Sahara can exceed 50 degrees Celsius, while winter nights can drop below freezing. The wind is a constant presence, moving the sand and raising the dust storms that can reduce visibility to zero and disorient even experienced travelers. Against all of this, the trans-Saharan caravans moved for more than 1,000 years, carrying gold and salt and slaves and scholars and manuscripts across terrain that offered no roads, no fuel, no supplies, no water between wells, sometimes hundreds of kilometers apart. The logistics were formidable. A caravan of 500 camels, each carrying 250 kilograms of goods, transported 125 metric tons of cargo. The planning required was not spontaneous. The routes were known and mapped in the minds of experienced guides. The wells were known in their reliability across different seasons, and the caravan was organized before departure to carry enough water to reach the next well, even if several days away. The guides were the critical personnel. Without a guide who knew the route, the specific sequence of wells and landmarks and astronomical bearings that allowed navigation across the featureless interior, the caravan was lost. The guides were typically Tuareg, or Berber nomads, whose communities had been operating in the Sahara for generations. The guide who led Mansa Musa's caravan across the Sahara in 1324 was the custodian of knowledge no less precious than the astronomical tables in the Sankore library. Knowledge stored in a human memory rather than a manuscript, but no less carefully accumulated and no less essential to the civilization that depended on it. The oases along the trans-Saharan routes were the civilization's rest points, its way station infrastructure. Some of them, Sijil Masa in Morocco, Tagaza and Tuat and Gadames in the interior, Agadez in what is now Niger, were substantial settlements, commercial centers in their own right, where the caravans resupplied and the merchants bought and sold, and the local governors collected their transit taxes. Others were nothing more than a well and a date grove, enough to water the animals and refill the water containers and move on. The oasis was to the trans-Saharan traveller what the caravanserai was to the Silk Road traveller, the human mark on an inhuman landscape, the sign that others had been here before and that survival was possible. The kola nut. I have mentioned it but not explained it, and it deserves explanation because it was, alongside gold and salt, one of the defining commodities of the trans-Saharan trade. Kola is a genus of tree that grows in the forest zone of West Africa, and its seeds, the kola nuts, each about the size of a large walnut, contain caffeine and theobromine, the same compounds that give coffee and chocolate their stimulating properties. In a world without coffee, and before tea reached West Africa, kola was the primary mild stimulant available across a very wide area. The giving of kola nuts was a gesture of hospitality and respect. The chewing of kola sustained travelers on long journeys by suppressing hunger and fatigue, and the kola nut was the product of the forest zone exclusively, which meant it was a trade good moving north and east from its point of origin, crossing the same routes that the gold travelled, enriching the same commercial system. In the 19th century, when European pharmaceutical companies became interested in the stimulant properties of the kola nut, extracts of kola became ingredients in tonics and beverages, including, in 1886, a beverage formulated by John Pemberton in Atlanta, which he named Coca-Cola. The name remains, and in it is the trace of a West African forest tree that sustained the civilization of the Mali Empire. The kola nut that a Mandinka merchant chewed on the Saharan crossing in 1320, and the drink that carries its name today, are separated by 700 years and half a planet, but connected by the specific chemistry of the kola tree and the specific human need for mild stimulation. I want to return to the manuscripts, because the manuscripts are the most extraordinary thing about Timbuktu, and the thing most consistently under-discussed. The image of Timbuktu that most Western accounts offer is primarily commercial, the city of gold, the centre of the trans-Saharan trade, the place from which the wealth of the Mali Empire was administered. This is real but partial. Timbuktu was also a city of the book, a city that accumulated manuscripts the way that Alexandria accumulated scrolls, and for some of the same reasons, It was a city at the intersection of trade routes, a city where wealth produced the leisure and the patronage that supported intellectual production, a city where the specific religious tradition of Islam made the acquisition and preservation of texts a meritorious act as well as a commercial investment. The specific content of the Timbuktu manuscripts is only now being systematically studied. The project of cataloguing and digitizing the hundreds of thousands of manuscripts that survived the 2012 crisis and the earlier centuries of careful preservation by scholarly families is ongoing, and the findings have regularly surprised scholars who came to the project with assumptions about what the manuscripts would contain. The assumption that sub-Saharan Africa produced no significant original intellectual tradition, an assumption that was embedded in European colonial-era historiography, and that persisted in some quarters long after it should have been abandoned, has been definitively refuted by the manuscript evidence. The Timbuktu manuscripts contain original contributions to legal theory, to astronomical calculation, to mathematical method, to Quranic interpretation, to historical analysis. They contain poetry in Arabic and in local languages. They contain correspondence between scholars that allows us to reconstruct intellectual debates conducted across vast distances. They contain the administrative records of the commercial community, contracts, accounts, records of transactions that allow economic historians to reconstruct the workings of the trans-Saharan trade in more detail than the narrative sources permit. There is a manuscript in the Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu. The collection is named for the great 16th century Timbuktu scholar Ahmed Baba al-Masufi al-Timbukti, the most celebrated intellectual figure the city produced, who was deported to Marrakech by the Moroccan conquerors in 1593 and who spent the rest of his life as an exile, that contains an astronomical table calculating the positions of stars and planets for a specific set of dates and latitudes that can be precisely determined by modern astronomical calculation. The table's calculations are accurate to a degree that implies the use of systematic observation rather than simple copying from an earlier source. Someone in Timbuktu, at a specific date, was making systematic astronomical observations and recording them with the care and precision of a working astronomer. The manuscript is the record of that work. The name of the observer is not given. The observation was made in Timbuktu, at the specific coordinates of Timbuktu, for the specific purpose of producing tables useful to navigators and calendar makers in the region. It is a piece of original scientific work, produced at the southern edge of the Sahara, in a city that most people in the world outside West Africa had never heard of. Ahmad Baba himself was born in 1556, more than 2 centuries after Mansa Musa, but he is the clearest individual face the Timbuktu intellectual tradition has given us. He was a scholar of Islamic law and theology, a prolific author who produced over 40 books. His personal library is said to have held 1,600 volumes. He was deported to Marrakech by the Moroccan conquerors in 1593, along with other leading scholars, as part of the Moroccan administration's effort to neutralize potential resistance from the city's intellectual elite. In Marrakech, he did not stop being a scholar. He taught, he wrote, he argued, in the specific way a scholar argues, with text and logic rather than weapons, for the legitimacy of the civilization the Moroccan invasion had disrupted. He was eventually allowed to return to Timbuktu, where he died in 1627. His books survived, copied in the libraries of Marrakech and Timbuktu, read in the centuries after his death. Ahmad Baba is the Timbuktu tradition in a single person, the scholar who accumulated knowledge and shared it and preserved it through disaster and exile, who understood that the knowledge held in manuscripts was worth more than comfort or safety. He stands in a line that includes the great scholars of every civilization we have discussed in this series: the librarians of Alexandria, the translators of Baghdad, the monks who copied texts in cold scriptoria. People who understood that the transmission of knowledge requires specific human effort, and that when those efforts are not made, the knowledge is lost. The griots remember what the manuscripts cannot say. The intellectual life of Timbuktu was the life of a literate elite, conducted in a learned language, Arabic, that was not the mother tongue of most of the empire's population. The griots were the intellectuals of the non-literate majority, the keepers of the histories and the genealogies and the stories and the songs that gave the Mandu world its sense of itself. They stood in a different relationship to the truth than the manuscript scholars did. Their tradition privileged the performance, the context, the specific audience and occasion over the abstract accuracy of the written record. But the function was the same: the preservation and transmission of knowledge, the maintenance of the community's memory of itself. The griots travelled with the Mansa. They were present at every significant event of the court's life. They knew things that no manuscript recorded, because the things that griots recorded were not the things that manuscripts recorded. They remembered the genealogies in the forms that the families who owned them wanted them remembered. They remembered the specific praise songs for specific rulers that encoded, in their imagery and their language, the values that the Mali state claimed to embody. They remembered the histories of battles and alliances and marriages that the manuscript tradition did not think worth writing down, and they transmitted all of this in performance, in the specific form of the praise song and the narrative and the genealogical recitation, to the next generation of griots who would carry it forward. The griot tradition has survived. It is changed. The Mali Empire is gone, and the specific political context that shaped the griot's function has been replaced by centuries of colonial rule and independent statehood. But the tradition is alive. The Jelly of the Mande world still perform, still maintain the genealogies, still know the old songs. The Sundiata epic is still performed. The specific praise songs for specific Mali emperors are largely gone, and the specific genealogical knowledge that particular griot families held in the 14th century is largely gone with them. What survives is the frame, the form, the continuing practice, a living thing, but one that has been severely pruned by 5 centuries of political upheaval and the gradual erosion of the patronage systems that gave the griot's role its social weight. The gold trade changed. The trans-Saharan trade declined after the Portuguese established the sea routes along the African coast in the 15th century, and it declined further after the Moroccan conquest disrupted the political organisation of the Niger Bend region in 1591. The specific commercial civilization that the trans-Saharan trade sustained, the specific configuration of cities and scholars and merchants and griots that was the Mali Empire and its successors, was not maintained. The landscape changed. The routes changed, the wealth went elsewhere. What remains is the city. Timbuktu is still there, on the same ground where it has been since the nomads first made their seasonal camp, beside the Niger River 1,000 years ago. It is smaller than it was at its peak. The desertification has been advancing on it for decades, and the tourist trade that sustained some of its economy in the late 20th century was severely damaged by the instability of the 2012 crisis and has not fully recovered. The manuscripts are in Bamako, or in the Ahmed Baba Institute, or still in the private collections of the scholarly families who preserved them through the centuries. The mosques still stand, still plastered with the mud that the community reapplies every year after the rains, still topped with the protruding palmwood ribs that Al-Sahili may or may not have introduced in the 14th century. The city is there. The tradition is there, damaged and reduced but alive. The gold is in the Catalan Atlas, and the light of a painted image of a painted king holding a painted gold nugget is the same light that fell on the actual gold in the actual hands of the actual man who crossed the actual desert with 60,000 actual people, whose passage through the markets of Cairo disturbed the price of gold for a decade, whose return to his empire brought an architect who built mosques that are still standing, whose endowment of the Sankore school created the conditions for a library tradition that produced hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, some of which survived the Moroccan invasion and the 2012 crisis and are being read by scholars today who are still discovering what they contain. The light that falls on Timbuktu in the late afternoon, when the sun is low and the mud brick of the mosques catches it and turns warm amber, and the shadows lengthen across the sandy streets, and the desert begins, just beyond the city's edge, in its patient advance. That light is very old, and it has been falling on this ground for a very long time, on the camel caravans and the manuscript scholars and the griots and the cadis and the merchants and the students and the ordinary people whose names we do not know, who lived and worked and prayed and died in the city, at the edge of the desert and the bend of the river, where the gold trade and the book trade and the salt trade and the idea trade all met and made something that the world did not know existed and still does not fully know. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.